England, a land that has seen its fair share of conquests. There were the Romans, Saxons, Vikings, and of course, the Normans. However, no conquest was as successful or as popular as the Norman Conquest of England. In this video, we will examine how the conquest started, proceeded, and how it ended. Let's jump right into it with England pre-conquest. The events leading up to the Norman Conquest start with the crowning of King Edward the Confessor in 1042. When King Edward came to power in 1042, he knew very little about England. You see, he spent most of his life in Normandy and grew accustomed to the Norman way of life. So when he became king, he appointed many Normans over Englishmen to high positions in English court, which angered many. One family that had put up with enough of King Edward was the Godwins, who would rebel against their king. However, once word got out that many other families had sided with King Edward, the Godwins went into hiding. However, they would emerge in 1052 with an army of mercenaries, and once word got out, many powerful families would then put their support towards the Godwins. After the events in 1052, King Edward would now become more of a puppet for Earl Godwin, but this would not last long because in 1053 Earl Godwin had died, leaving his son Harold to take his position. The relationship between King Edward, who would be a submissive king, to Harold, which would last until King Edward's death in 1066. When King Edward had died, the Witan was called very quickly to elect a new king, who would be Harold. However, there was another who also made a strong claim to the throne, and he was William, Duke of Normandy. Duke William was born in 1028 and became a duke at a very young age. However, William would later go on to take strong control of his lands in Normandy. With King Edward, who had put many Normans into high positions, it would soon catch the attention of William, which it did because in 1051 King Edward had promised the throne to William if he were to die with no heirs. So when news got out that King Edward had died with no heirs, he had assumed that he should be the rightful ruler of England, because he was promised. But when he found out that Harold had already been crowned King of England over him, he would gather his troops and prepare for an invasion. With all the pieces set in motion, it was now inevitable that England would be invaded. However, for King Harold II, it was a question of who and when. You see, William had already made his claim to the throne and would most likely be invading from the south. But he was not the only one. Harold Harada also made a claim to the throne and would be coming to take it, and he would be coming from the north. So for King Harold II, he had to wait patiently for one opponent to attack first. It turned out that Harold Harada would be the first to invade, so King Harold II mustered his troops and marched towards them. In September of 1066, the forces of King Harold II surprised the army of Harold Harada, which not only gave him the edge, but also the victory. The two armies met at Stamford Bridge, and King Harold's forces ended up beating the forces of Harold Harada, who had ended up dying on the battlefield. And once the Norwegians had lost this battle, the remaining forces and ships had sailed back home. Even with the win against the Norwegians, this war was only halfway done because King Harold II still had to deal with the Normans. The Normans up until this moment couldn't cross the English Channel because the winds were too strong and not in their favor, so they had to wait for months until the winds had finally shifted, and once they did, they finally crossed the English Channel. The Normans had finally reached the English shore on September 28th of 1066 and were able to set up fortifications with ease since no one was guarding the shores. King Harold II heard that the Normans had arrived and made a quick turnaround. Within only a couple of days, he marched his army over 240 miles from York to Hastings. However, this haste would come to hurt King Harold II more than help him. Because of this march, his troops were tired and they had just recently fought a battle. The two sides would meet each other for battle on Sunday of October 14th of 1066, and this battle would be called the Battle of Hastings. For the battle, the Anglo-Saxons would stick to their shield wall formation, while the Normans would take advantage of their cavalry, while also having archers and infantrymen. When the battle started, the shield wall proved useful since it was able to stop the Normans' cavalry multiple times. The Normans would retreat until William rallied them for another attack, and this attack was so successful since the Anglo-Saxons had broke formation to punish the running troops. Furthermore, King Harold II was also struck by an arrow and died. All these causes led to the Anglo-Saxon defeat. William would be crowned the King of England shortly after the battle in 1066, and he would be named William the Conqueror. With William the Conqueror now king, most of his reign would be about solidifying his rule and having to deal with revolts. In fact, it is said that he ruled with an iron fist. William the Conqueror had to deal with Wales first, and they would be put down shortly after. However, there were also problems with Scotland. The King of Scotland, Malcolm Canmore, would take his Scottish troops and raid along the English border. Just like in Wales, William the Conqueror would put a stop to the raids as well. Additionally, Robert Curthose, who was the son of William the Conqueror, would turn on his father and rebel. However, in 1078, the father and son would settle for peace. Overall, it took a long time for William the Conqueror to secure England. These were not the only events of importance throughout his reign. William the Conqueror would give most of the English land to Norman and French nobles, and in return for the land, the nobles had to pledge loyalty to the king. This would be a whole event called the Salisbury Oath, and it also would be the start of feudalism in England. Lastly, throughout William the Conqueror's reign, the country would be, for the most part, pretty safe, and there was very low crime. You see, the punishment for crimes were a lot harsher now under King William. And he also had elevated sheriffs, so that they would do a better job at keeping the peace. Overall, the reign of King William the Conqueror was spent mainly putting down revolts, starting feudalism in England, bringing the Norman Church into England, and having very low crime. On his deathbed, he said that William Rufus would get the throne. This was the Norman Conquest of 1066.